first phase, these were the companies, as I mentioned, and this gives you a sense of the nature of the projects that we were studying. So all of them were resident in central research and development groups, and most of them were resident in central research groups, or they started somewhere else and they got pulled into central research and development groups. And you can see that they were all very leading edge technologies at the time. Remember, this was 1994, 95 timeframe. So I will just remind you that in the internet in 1994, you couldn't buy anything, right? There was no payment system, there was no way to move information. You could look things up, and that was about it. And so, for example, this one at Nortel Networks, which was a telecommunications company, were obviously trying to figure out they're going to get completely displaced by the internet. They could see that coming. And so they had a little project here about how we make software rentable and downloadable through the internet. So they were working on that problem early on. And anyway, the hybrid vehicles in 1994, you know, of course General Motors had been trying to make sure this did not happen for many years, right? And so, but they had a small team in there trying to make it happen. So this is a very interesting dynamic. All right, accelerometer technology, so a little chip that could look at changes in speed. And so Analog Devices, which was a chip manufacturer or a chip designer, learned of this technology at Boston University, and they wanted to develop this because it was their entree to the automotive industry, they thought. We're going to help deploy airbags at 1/20th the cost of the current solution for deploying airbags. That was their dream, okay? It took them, once they got the technology to work, it took them 11 years to enter that market and begin making profit. But in the middle, many new marketplaces opened up for them. Gaming, for example, satellites, all kinds of different industries that they entered, not anticipating that. Okay, so each of those, just to tell you a little bit about our process, I don't know if I have that in here for phase one. And each of our team members, so we had 10 team members, was responsible for managing one or two of those relationships with those companies and organized a visit for all of our team to go and meet all of those teams, the members of those teams. So we would go, we'd show up in our big car, our big van. We'd start at 8 in the morning, and each one of us would interview each one of them. And so it was a crazy day of rotating rooms. The guys on the team would stay in the same room all day long, and then I'd come and interview, let's say, Mario, and then my colleague would interview Mario, and then the next person would interview Mario. Poor Mario is exhausted at the end of the day, but then I interview Mario, and then Tatiana, and then on and on and on. I go through the day, 8 hours in a row. We each had our own set of questions. So I was the market research person on our team. We had an organizational behavior. We had an entrepreneurship. We had R&D management. We had cost accounting. All these professors with different kinds of interests to learn about those projects from their perspective. So our reference point was this. I don't know if you recognize this. How many of you know this system? The stage gate process for new product development. All right, fairly familiar with this system. And so Robert Cooper had written this book and many, many articles in which he had brought a discipline to the new product development process in companies. And he was saying you have to have cross-functional teams, you have to know, you have clear issues that have to be dealt with first and proven before you can get the okay to move to the next stage. If you can't get this done to the satisfaction of the review board, your project is killed. It brings discipline. And the problem with this, there's many problems with it, but the main problem for breakthrough innovation is that you have to know all the information required for stage one long before it can be known in a breakthrough innovation world where everything is quite ambiguous. You might know in breakthrough innovation, for example, that you have a fiber that can make light travel 40,000 times faster than is known currently. That was one of our projects. That's all they knew. What was the market size? You know, when was this going to diffuse? What's the price going to be? What's the return on investment? You have no idea any of these kinds of things. And yet, in order to pass through gate 2, you have to know all these things. So they would get killed. And in fact, we saw a number of the teams try to go through this process. And they would get killed, right? No, not approved. The project would not be approved. So they'd go back to their team. They would change their assumptions, change their models, make it work here for the criteria, and get approved. So it was not really an honest conversation about what this potential project could do for the company. So we contrast that nice, organized model with the data. So this is a timeline, a piece of analysis that we did for one of our projects. So this was the biodegradable polyester that DuPont was developing, which they called Biomax. It still exists today as a platform of business in the company. So Biomax was a degradable polyester that was developed in response to a customer request. The customer was Procter & Gamble. The request was, we need a disposable diaper for diapers. They're filling up the landfills too much. We're going to have regulation. This has to degrade. And so that was a very interesting request. DuPont knew we had to get into this kind of business. And unfortunately for DuPont, Procter & Gamble withdrew the request because the government legislation did not come through fast enough, and they just said, stop the project. Well, DuPont had already done the work. They had this great technology. They had no idea what to do with it. And so that was one of the projects that we were able to study. When we were studying it, they were looking to use these as for banana harvesting, to hold the bags, to hold the bananas, because then you could take it, put it on the truck, and by the time you got it to the store, the bag was gone. So we called it the banana bag project. But it was also used for mulch to plant, for planting. In Israel, they were using this all around in the kibbutz when they have different kinds of planting gardens. I don't know, all different kinds of uses. But so this project had been going on since 1989. We started tracking them from here to here. Well, actually, we kept calling them up because they were so interesting. But what you see are all of these little codes of a D stands for discontinuity. A discontinuity was a shock, some kind of a surprise, usually a negative surprise, a setback. A technical test didn't work, or the use in the market was not going well. Or they would lose a team member. Here, one of the team members died unexpectedly. All different kinds of setbacks for their team. The thickness of this line indicates the resources that the team had at that period of time. So this is as good as it got right here. Here we had 1/2 of a full-time equivalent person on the team, keeping it alive. It was the original inventor trying to keep the team alive. Every time you see one of these dropping down, this project was moved from one unit to another in DuPont. And so over the course of time we studied them, it moved into 4 different business units and was pulled back into R&D by the director of new business development, who really saw the importance of this project. So every time it was getting starved for resources in a business unit, he would pull it back to R&D and save the project until it looked like somebody else wanted it. So it had no home in DuPont. Okay? And then finally, all these lines are little attempts to develop applications in the marketplace. So these would be potential customers calling up saying, I see a use for this, let's try it. All right? So many, many different explorations in the marketplace over time, many different different types. Okay, so we did this analysis for the Biomax project, but we did it for the 11 other projects, and we started to see some really interesting patterns. All right. First pattern, it does not follow the stage gate approach to new product development, right? But as a result of that, the main insights that we gained was, all these types of uncertainty that occurred. So in the literature and at the IRI and got people in R&D labs will tell you that breakthrough innovation is when you have high technical uncertainty and high market uncertainty, right? In fact, the guys at the IRI told us that is in a 2x2 matrix, high, low, high, low. It's called suicide square. You do not want to be on a project that is in that square of the matrix. It's not good for your career, right? They said you got to hinge out into one of the adjacent squares. Well, all of our projects experienced high technical and market uncertainty, but we also saw resource uncertainty and organizational uncertainty. And so I would just explain kind of quickly. Resource uncertainty means not only funding, but more importantly, competencies. Do we have the right skills on our team? Do we have the right equipment here? We're moving into a new area, a new domain for the company and maybe for the market. So for example, in one of our projects for IBM, they needed a certain kind of talent. It was a silicon germanium chip, and I don't even understand what kind of material scientist or electrical engineering person they needed, but some type that was very, very rare. So they opened an office right outside of MIT in Boston so that they could go and interview every person coming out of the very rare degree program and hire them immediately because they had such need for this kind of resource. So these competencies were quite a problem, quite a challenge. Not just talent, but also access to markets and these kinds of things. And then organizational uncertainty. What you saw in the DuPont Biomax case where it kept changing homes, we have no clear strategy of where we're going to grow this business. And each business unit leader might like to see part of that project, but not the whole thing. They're not interested in the whole thing. And so you have a lot of issues of these programs dropping through the cracks of the organization. All right? And sometimes they're strategically attractive, and sometimes they're strategically not so attractive. But over a development period of 11 years, you need some continuity of strategy. All right? So organizational uncertainty was very, very important. And our view was if the project managers could really get explicit about managing resource and organizational uncertainty, these projects could move along at a much better clip. We could learn faster and know what to do next, as opposed to just wandering around, maybe we'll try this business unit, maybe we'll try this business unit, which is what we were observing. Okay. We also saw, and I'm sure it would be no surprise, that since these were mostly R&D projects, the manager of the project was very focused on this. Maybe a little bit on this. Never even talked about these except, political problems, right? Somebody else should take care of these kinds of issues, right? So we thought we need to make these things more explicit. And then these uncertainties drove these sets of challenges that the teams faced. So this is about getting great ideas and articulating them together in a way that could be a real breakthrough. Living with chaos is really about how you manage a project that has all these dimensions of uncertainty going on at the same time. This one, how do we learn about a market that doesn't even exist yet? It's not structured, right? And then we have many degrees of freedom of how we're going to make money doing this. How do we explore and make decisions about the business model? This one, most project managers put together a budget and a proposal. They receive that budget, that resource, and they're measured on managing on time and within the budget. Not one of our project managers thought like that or acted like that. In fact, they were much more entrepreneurial. So instead of having resources allocated to them and working to meet those, they were in a resource acquisition mentality. So they would say, the world is my oyster. They were involved in partnerships all the time. They were many different types of arrangements that they made to get free help, essentially, from other people. And so they were much more entrepreneurial about acquiring resources. You know, the definition of entrepreneurship is leveraging other people's resources in behalf of your own objective. Right? All right, so that's what they did. And then this one was the biggest surprise for us, which is, how does a project move from R&D into a business unit? That transition was extremely difficult, very challenging, and that's why we developed the Transition Readiness Assessment tool to help with that. And then here, what are the roles of different types of people? You know, all these projects in this first phase are driven by champions, you know, very passionate people who believed in their project, and they could find a sponsor in the senior leadership who would help them break all the rules, right? So could we get a little bit more sophisticated than that, was kind of our question. And then we started to see in 2 of our companies an underlying infrastructure for helping these project champions move their projects along. So in DuPont, this guy, the new business development guy in R&D, that plucked the project back every time it was getting starved for resources. He had a little staff of coaches that helped all these kinds of projects. And then in Nortel Networks, they had the vice president of the business ventures group. She had a portfolio of little projects, and she managed it as a portfolio. That's the way she funded it. That's the way she made decisions. She knew some would lose, some were going to be winners, and at the end of the day, all we needed were a few winners. So those were quite interesting to us, an organizational group that helped those projects. Okay, so that caused us to then say at the end of this first phase, companies can get better at this. It's not that difficult. If we start to think of this as a system and as a portfolio and as a capability, rather than one, you know, really passionate champion trying to move his project along. And so we started to develop this idea of a radical innovation hub that would be like the Business Ventures Group in Nortel, closely connected to R&D and very connected to senior leadership, where the decisions that were being made on behalf of the company's strategic intent of its view of the future for the company, right? So even if any single project wasn't making money within 3 years, we knew we still needed to make that investment because it's important for the company's future, right? And so that was the idea, that you'd have a radical innovation hub that had a portfolio of projects, that had mechanisms for getting ideas and developing them into business opportunities, that had a governance board of some sort that helped make decisions about the portfolio. Each project should have its own advisory board that had the right skills and competencies and networks that could help these projects. And you'd have a help of when it's time for the project to transition. It's not just a handoff. You know, you create a big thing, a big governance board to ensure that that project doesn't lose funding in that very difficult time. So, but this was a fantasy. You know, we just made this up. And so we had to test this. And that became the driving motivation for the next research program then for us. Oh, yeah, let's see, where was I here? This was just the way we articulated capability for breakthrough innovation, or capacity, or really this should be capability. If you have a low maturity, low capability, everything's based on an individual person who's driving this and won't let it stop. You know, in your companies, those of you from companies, you've got these guys, they won't stop with the project, right? And you say we're very dependent on them and we like them, but sometimes, you know, how can we help them and provide support and move them on to other projects if you need to, right? But so over here, is where we kind of describe what that infrastructure could look like. You know, how to, in fact, to build our team, how do we work with human resources to develop a strategy for identifying and selecting and rewarding and retaining these people, all right? Many of these champions will leave the company over time. They get alienated, right? Sometimes you wish they would leave the company. I mean, they're annoying at times, right? So, okay. Okay, and then I would just skip quickly through this. It's just the point that this one challenge was the biggest surprise to us here, and so we went back to the Industrial Research Institute and we said, you know, as we were presenting our results, this is a big problem. And they said, yeah, it's a really big problem in our company, so what can we do? And so we did identify the series of kind of critical issues that we saw in our cases. And we worked with the IRI members to develop a tool, the Transition Readiness Assessment Tool. We published that tool, and there are companies who do use it. This is just a bunch of, you know, stuff about our methodology that we use to make it a reliable and valid tool.